patients in their complete individuality, complexity, and their totality. And certainly palliative care is also a discipline which takes care of the whole human being. I know at the lecture that Dr. Sanders gave last night, there was discussion of the importance of volunteers. Now, I have to say, I think in family medicine we don't have any volunteers yet, but we are going to learn from palliative care and adopt all your best practices. Another similarity is the continuity of care. So in family medicine, we like to say we care for our patients from cradle to grave. And certainly, I would encourage any of you who are caregivers in palliative medicine to remember patients' family physicians if you're caring for them in their last moments of life or in moments when they are suffering from critical illness. It has happened all too often in Montreal hospitals that patients pass away in a hospital where their family physician works without their family physician ever having been notified that they were admitted. So let's remember the continuity, because that is precious for all of the patients that we care for. And the final thing I wanted to say, I know there are three. Let's see. Usually I don't make more than 3 points because I can't remember the 3 points. Oh, I know. Palliative care is an exceptional discipline because of the integration and the interdisciplinarity that people all work within. So it's wonderful to see music therapists, chaplains, art therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, nurses, doctors, all working together in a team. And I think that that is what really makes palliative care such an exceptional discipline. I am thrilled that palliative care at McGill is part of the Department of Family Medicine, and I'm looking forward to many more happy collaborations to produce this conference every 2 years with Dr. Sanders and with the whole Flanders palliative chair team that works with him. So thank you all, and have a wonderful Congress.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dove. The humanities are an integral component of this Congress because humanism is an essential aspect of our work. I would like to introduce the first of 4 reflections that will take place over the course of this Congress, and which give us an opportunity to center ourselves in advance of our plenary sessions. They are part this year of something I would like to call your attention to specifically, which is a world-class collection of artworks curated and assembled by Elle Flanders, daughter of Cappy and Eric Flanders, for whom this chair is named. Art at the End of Life includes works of art by some of the leading contemporary artists in Canada, and includes 2 film screenings, both of which will also be available through your virtual access. The works are housed in a dedicated space in the main exhibition hall, just behind us, as well as in the meditation and Tai Chi room, and I really encourage you to seek them out because it was a tremendous effort to put them together, and they really are both absorptive and powerful, and reflections on what we've been through. For our reflections, Alyssa Bistinath is a filmmaker and photographer living in Toronto. She focuses on themes of memory and belonging. Bistinath, the daughter of Guyanese immigrants, endeavors to look at modes of representation by investigating nostalgia, exploring evidence, and interrupting the archive. Most recently, she was featured in the Art Gallery of Ontario's Art in the Spotlight and in Canadian Art for her series Isolation Photographs, many of which are part of the exhibition that we have assembled. Her work includes Portals from 2018, a video installation commissioned by the City of Toronto for Nuit Blanche, and the documentary Why We Fight from 2016, which won Best Canadian Short at the Regent Park Film Festival. Bistinath has her Master's of Fine Arts and teaches at Ryerson University. So you can go ahead with the reflection. I'd like to introduce our first plenary speaker this evening. Dr. Fliss Murtugh qualified in medicine in the UK in 1986. She worked in general practice, which is like family medicine, for almost 10 years, and then undertook specialist training in palliative medicine. She worked at the Cicely Saunders Institute in King's College London from 2002 to 2017, where she completed her PhD, became a clinical senior lecturer, and then a reader in palliative medicine. She is now a professor of palliative care at Hull York Medical School and visiting professor of palliative care at the Cicely Saunders Institute at King's College London in the UK. I want to add that in addition to this impressive bio, Dr. Murtugh came incredibly highly recommended as a speaker, and we feel very lucky to have you. And when I asked some of my European colleagues who I should look to come speak to us, I heard from several of them that Dr. Murtugh we would be very lucky to have Dr. Murtugh come. So we're so grateful that she's here with us, and I welcome you to the stage and thank you in advance for your words.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here, and isn't it wonderful to be here in person and reconnect both with old friends and new friends. Before I start, I wanted to just acknowledge someone who's been foundational for me in my research development, and that's Irene Higginson, who many of you will know. And I want to say I'm going to bring to this next 20 minutes some reflections of my own from my personal perspective, from my perspective as a doctor caring for people. And I went from research to full-time clinical practice at the start of the pandemic, and have only just begun to get back to research. But I'm also a real researcher at heart, and I'm going to bring you some evidence. And I hope that for all of you, there'll be some resonance and something to pick up from what I have to say. So I have no conflicts of interest, and we're going to just think in the next 20 minutes about what's been happening over the past 2 years of the pandemic, reflections, and then thinking where that brings us to and where we go forward. What I'd like to do, I'd like to think not only about what's happened, but also something that I would like to refer to as the space between. And I think this is akin to what Justin was talking about yesterday evening when he spoke of relationship. But I mean not simply relationship, but I mean what happens between us, between myself and yourself over the next 20 minutes, but also the spaces we create as we connect with people, whether that's the patients we care for, whether it's our families, whether it's each other in teams or colleagues around the world. So I wanted to know, when I reflected back on the last 2 years, what has this really meant? Cicely Saunders said that everybody matters. So how many people died in the last 2 years? It's quite difficult to find that out, actually. I think facts are often like gemstones. You see them glittering, you think they're going to be good, and then you pick them up and you look at them from different angles, and you actually see it's perhaps not what you thought. It might not be the real thing. It might not be a fact you can depend on. So if you look at the data, 6.5 million people have died from reported COVID since the start of the pandemic. If you're like me, millions are quite difficult. What do they mean? And I guess I put this in the context of the world population, which is 7.75 billion. At least it was in 2020. It's probably now pushing 8 billion. And billions are even more difficult than millions. What do they mean? 1,000 million? Still, what do they mean? And I guess it helps me if I think of roughly 1 in 1,000 people on this planet where there's been a reported death from COVID. 1 in 1,000, that is something which touches all of us very closely. Some of us much more than others, lots of different stories of what that actually means. But in reality, this is very different from what has happened, because it isn't just 6.5 million deaths reported from COVID, because you will know that many of us have experienced that the reporting has been very uneven. Some countries don't have robust reporting systems, of course. Some politicians and leaders would rather we didn't know the deaths from COVID in a particular country. So researchers have looked at excess deaths. What numbers of deaths have occurred beyond what would be expected in that year or month? And you can see from this slide that the most robust estimation that can be achieved, which is probably from the Economist team, where they've modelled looking at data from 223 countries, which is almost all of them, and you can see they estimate the actual number of deaths is 2 to 4 times higher. And that is about 15 to 17 million over those 2 years of the pandemic up until April. It also compares, I guess, with something we work with all the time, those deaths that occur year on year on year, which are not related to COVID. And I wanted to find out how we can contextualize this. And you can see that in a usual year, there might be around 55 million deaths around the world. So, does that help us? The best estimate then is perhaps that there have been 20 to 25 million deaths excess deaths since the pandemic started, okay? And that's over and above perhaps the 100 or 125 million which might have occurred anyway. So I still struggle to find what this means for us. If you look at the influenza pandemic in 1918 to 19, which is perhaps the most comparable evidence we have, there were about 1/3 of the population infected and about 50 million deaths as a bare minimum. So almost twice the size of the pandemic that you and I have lived through and are still living through. But actually, it isn't the numbers only which matter. So although everybody counts, and it's helpful to take the big picture view of this, we also want to know what was happening for those people. Where were they dying? This is data from the UK, and it's mirrored in quite a few of the developed nations. And we analysed this after 12 months of the pandemic. And you can see 4 graphs there. In the top left hand, you can see hospital deaths. And you can see very clearly 2 waves of the pandemic as they came through the UK. So 2 peaks at the start of that year and towards the end of that year. And if you look at care homes or nursing homes in the bottom left, you can see the same 2 peaks, but in the UK we were able to protect people in care homes and nursing homes much better in the second wave, so you see a much more truncated peak. But what was also interesting and what is so relevant for the work that we all do is the top right. So what was happening in people's homes. You can see here that not only were there an increased number of deaths, but it didn't really fall any less after that first wave. It carried on. So the increase was sustained at the first wave and between the waves, through the second wave, and has still been maintained to the present time. So what we're seeing is excess deaths at home, some of which relate to COVID, some of which don't relate to COVID, some of which occur from other conditions but because of COVID. And I think that has radically changed what many of us have experienced, which is that we have seen that across our communities there has been a real demand for palliative services and for family practice and all other community services to step up. In the bottom of that same graph, you can see what happened in hospices and inpatient palliative units. Now, the scale is different for this one, but I've left it so that you can actually see the graph. And actually, there were fewer deaths for us because many of the smaller units actually pivoted to deliver community-based care for people in their own homes. So those are some of the facts for what they're worth. But I think we want to understand the stories behind the facts. When we think back over the past 2 years, what are the paths that you and I and others travelled through COVID times? What was it that we thought and felt and did? What were our stories? And stories for me are the ways that we make sense of what's happening. It's the way we reach beyond our own time, our own limitations, our own experiences, to begin to connect and make a different reality. So for me, listening to stories and also listening for stories is such an important part of the work I do as a professional. And I'm sure the same is true for all of you. There is one quote from Maya Angelou which always resonates for me. And she said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. So I want to take us back to what we felt at the start of the pandemic. There was a lot of fear. I remember having to steel myself to drive into the hospital because we had a very junior set of nurses in our team, many of whom had small children at home, and they were truly frightened of what was going to happen, what would happen to them as they went into intensive care or the respiratory wards to look after people. And I can remember the experience of fear and also how you had to steel yourself to move through it. And that's something we forget very easily. There was something about uncertainty. We didn't know anything about what this was going to do, how it was going to affect our lives. I was walking recently and I came across this sign on the picture there. Didn't know what was behind that. But it did evoke a sense for me of walking through the mist on a cliff top. You just don't know what you're going to come across. And many of us found ourselves working very differently. This image for me says a lot because that's what it felt like. We were tossed by the waves, which we couldn't control. We were in teams which had been pulled together quite quickly and didn't normally work together. There's a great book which you may have come across called Duty of Care, written by Dominic Pimenta. And he says, the early days of COVID felt like trying to build a bicycle that you were already cycling down a very steep hill, needing the brakes and the pedals before you could even get them there, and going faster and faster. And I think many of us felt that because we could see the wave coming. I think it was Italy that was affected most, and then it came to us, and then to Canada and the States. And it was knowing what was coming and that apprehension, the speed with which we all had to work differently and fast and prepare for the unknown. And as the pandemic went on, I think profound senses of isolation took hold for some of us, certainly for some families and for some people who were isolating. A handing over of control from what might have been before. And I think for many of us too, we learnt about living differently with loss and death, both individually and collectively. Often we were alone or apart from the people that we would chose to be with. And we all had very different experiences. I know for myself, I lost a very dear sister, and I lost two very close friends during the pandemic. And for me, that broke down some of the barriers between professional and personal in a profound way that I hadn't experienced before. And it made it very different in terms of working with patients. But I guess my reflection on all of this, most dominant, is the divergence of the paths we walked. That feeling that as a professional you might walk one path and then you might come home to your family who were walking a different path. Or there might be professionals in the hospital or the community or a different team who were experiencing a very different path. And there was a profound sense of dislocation when we were hurtled from one path to another, from one world to another. So I would ask you all to consider the space between, what it is we create between ourselves and individuals, whether it be between a patient, with a professional, with a colleague, with a family member. What sort of a space between do we create, and have we created? Is it a safe space, a kind space, what Catherine Mannix would call a tender space? Or is it sometimes a harsh space, an exposing space, a difficult space? So I'm going to go back to some evidence for the last few minutes. Looking at the evidence that's published around what happened for the palliative care community over the past 2 years, there is a number of papers that show how much moral distress there has been. And this is distress that particularly comes with the work of being alongside people dying. This is work done by colleagues in London, multiple case studies where they really delineated the kind of moral distress. So despite the efforts of teams and individuals and organizations to support each other, actually the context, the speed, the isolation led to this accumulative moral distress, where people were dealing with things in a way and at a speed that they hadn't been used to. There's also a nice paper published by Simon Etkind and colleagues, where they, in the first year, pulled together a really good picture of how the sector how all the professionals in palliative and end-of-life care responded in different ways, and they delineate the system changes, the staff changes, the changes in the space and the nature of the space created, and also what they called the stuff, you know, the equipment and other things. There's also really good examples of innovations in care from around the world. This example is from the States, and it's an example of how the model of care in the emergency department changed dramatically, and to reach out to a lot more people needing palliative care. So going from a rather hands-off approach to embedded staff within the emergency room and training, support for the people working in the emergency room. There's also some really good evidence out there about how video, phone, and technology was used. And we all struggle with that when we have the opportunity to talk face to face. But actually, lots of things about it worked for some people. This is work from Italy. Augusto Caracini and his colleagues looked at this over an 8-month period, and that's why I highlight this evidence. And they showed that about half of the people that they cared for with ambulatory palliative care needs, people living at home, relatively earlier stage, actually coped very well and were very happy with that kind of phone or video follow-up. There's a very interesting piece of work that was done in the UK in the midst of the pandemic to say, actually, what are the resources we really need to care for people dying with COVID? And I would recommend this to you because it is rarely done. I haven't given you the actual data from it because it's locally informed. But to follow this kind of an approach to model exactly what is needed is a really important step to try and make sure we have the resources to deliver the care that's needed. And of course, because I'm a researcher, I wanted to know what was happening with research. This is a systematic review of evidence, and they looked in April of this year to find out what kind of collaborative research had been going on in the sector in relation to COVID. And what is fascinating to me is the novelty, the new connections that were made between people in different countries, between researchers and clinicians, to really demonstrate how you could work quickly and look fast at the important evidence to build answers for people who are looking from the world of practice. What are the answers? And here is just a little map of some of the areas that research covered. I would say, though, that we didn't always get things right, and we all know that. We don't always get things right with our services. This is work undertaken to look at 227 services across the 4 nations of the UK, and including about 2/3 of all of our hospice and community palliative teams. And what was really evident, even in the COVID pandemic, was that services were offering individual, tailored care to people as much as they could. But what was challenging about the findings is that there was not really the structural and systemic changes that some groups need because of how a particular illness, in this instance COVID, was affecting them. So this looked at minority ethnic groups and how there was a disproportionate impact from restrictions on visiting. There was a disproportionate impact because of communication issues and religious and faith needs, and a real profound mistrust in working with the professionals at times. So there was an inequity in how services were being delivered. And I think this is a wake-up call to us, because in every area of inequity and inequality, we can only address things if we make systematic structural changes. So where are we now after 2 years? Well, I think we all have a profound awareness of uncertainty that is different from 2 years ago. It's like going through an earthquake. The ground is never quite firm beneath your feet again. And also, we've been very much in the hands of political and other leaders, and we've had much control taken away from ourselves as we've been constrained to our homes or other constraints during our lives. I think we also experience how the health systems that responded well to what was happening are struggling to catch up and regain a sense of normality. There is going to be a long tail of adjustment, and there's a lot of financial pressures and workforce pressures that have come with that. And it was fascinating to me to listen to the news over here, very similar to some of the news about this back home. So I would say in conclusion that we're in a different place. The world has woken up somewhat to the need for palliative and end-of-life care. I think there's a growing need for it and a recognition of that need, but I think we also have so much further to go. I hope that you will think hard about the space between, that space where we can create openness and trust, and where together we can do amazing things together, creatively, differently, with new connections in different ways. And I would say we have to go forward and think about freeing the untold stories, of which there are many over these past 2 years and beyond, listening to and listening for those stories, remembering those we have lost, but also building on the connection, meaning, and reality through the stories. Where are we now? Well, when I went past that sign, there were some surprising things on the other side. These tiny little flowers growing on the side of the path, opening up to a completely new vista, a different picture. So I hope somehow some of that has resonated with you in the space between. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murtugh. So much of what you said resonated with me, and I was taken back to some of my early days caring for people at the beginning of the pandemic, and there are people in this room with whom we were very much in the boat together, and it brought back very vividly some of the early days of that experience. I was struck so much by this reference to this shared space, and I would encourage people to use, or the space between, I would encourage people to use this time to cultivate those spaces. And also to think about the way in which, as we return to this new space, I think it's such a beautiful metaphor to think about what we bring to that, and the kind of energy that we bring to those spaces. Whether it's, is it a generous space, or are we left in a place where sometimes we find ourselves in a jaded space? So that resonated so much with me. I also hear in your call to action something that I think we can bring out here, which is, builds upon this idea of there being no greater agony than being an untold story inside you. And I would encourage each of you to find someone to tell a meaningful story from your life in the last 2 years. Because I think it's only through telling these stories that we can begin the process of healing ourselves from what has been such a difficult time. It's also a wonderful transition to our next speaker, who I think has proven herself a wonderful storyteller and an important storyteller. Dr. Sunita Puri is the program director of the Hospice and Palliative Medicine Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts, where she's an associate professor of clinical medicine. She completed medical school and residency training at the University of California, San Francisco, followed by a fellowship at Stanford. She is the author of an extraordinary book, That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour, a critically acclaimed literary memoir examining her journey to the practice of palliative medicine, and her quest to help patients and families redefine what it means to live and die well in the face of serious illness. The recipient of a Rhodes Scholarship, her writing and book have been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Atlantic, NPR, The Guardian, India Today, and The New Yorker. In 2018, she was awarded the Etzheim Tree of Life Award from the USC School of Medicine, awarded annually to a member of the faculty who, in the eyes of the campus community, models and provides humanistic and compassionate care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunita Puri.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me here to speak. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. I want to tell you a story. I began my palliative care training the day after my residency in internal medicine ended. I fancied myself comfortable with the idea of death and dying. I'd been raised by very deeply spiritual parents from India who taught me early on that everything, the plant in our living room, the cat I'd just brought home from a neighbor's home, and ourselves would eventually change and die, that this was the law of the universe. But when I entered fellowship training and suddenly every one of my patients lived in that borderland between living and dying, I began to struggle with the question of why. Why had death come so soon for a man who had just retired, only to learn weeks later that he had end-stage stomach cancer? Why did a former surgeon dedicated to saving lives get hit by a drunk driver and die in the same trauma ICU where he cared for others? How was it that the lady with pancreatic cancer was pain-free and ready to go to her daughter's wedding, only to be found dead in her bed the night before? As the year went on, I battled with myself. On one hand, I understood intellectually that change is the only constant in life. The seasons change, our feelings towards one another change, our heart rates and blood pressures change. But confronting the most profound of changes, suffering, illness, and death on a daily basis, left me bereft, unable to detach myself from the ideas I had about how someone was too good a person to suffer, or how they died in a way that I felt they did not deserve. I didn't feel like I could talk about any of this, these struggles, with the people who were training me, because I didn't want to appear, quote unquote, too emotional or ill-equipped for this work. Then something quite unexpected happened. Oh, by the way, I have no conflicts of interest. I'm sorry. This is where my story took a little detour. I apologize. These were also my learning objectives, but as I said, I kind of jump right into stories for better or worse, so many apologies. It also meets all the CanMed's competency frameworks. So this is what happened. Back to the main storyline. I happened to come upon a Vietnamese Buddhist temple one day when I was driving around after work. I got lost. I couldn't find the entrance to the freeway because there had been construction going on. So I took this detour and I entered the temple thinking this might be a good place to go after this particular day. And I found a group of Buddhist monks. They were gathered around a table using multicolored sand to create a really intricate painting. And this is an example of one here called a mandala. I returned almost every day after work to watch them create this painting, which I thought must be part of a permanent collection or a new decoration for the temple, which itself was absolutely stunning and stunning in its simplicity. One day I gathered, and one day I returned, and I found a crowd gathered around the monks, some of whom were chanting in a low guttural tone. I didn't know what was going on, and there were a lot of people in front of me, so I stood on my tiptoes to try to see what was happening around me. And when I stood on my tiptoes, I saw that the monks were methodically sweeping the sand away, rendering the painting a pile of dust. I started to cry as I watched, not only because the painting, this thing I had become attached to, was a thing of the past, but also because the very hands that created it were content to let it go. The monks had surrendered to and embodied this. In this way, impermanence was not just a spiritual idea or fact of life, but again, a law of nature. The painting always contained its destruction. As it came to life, its end was certain. This ceremony, which challenged my own thought that I understood impermanence, helped me to see, to really, really, really see and feel in my body what had been hard to understand, even though I had been immersed in the most profound changes from the people around me who I was taking care of. We as human beings resist change. And impermanence, this idea, challenges our narratives or the stories we tell ourselves about our lives and the world around us. The philosophy of impermanence requires that we be open to accepting the ways that our stories change. It requires us to ask, who will I be when I grow older? When I lose someone I love? When I grow sick? It requires us to see change as a type of loss, even though the change is sometimes for something better than the condition that preceded it. And if we can cultivate an understanding of this within ourselves as palliative medicine practitioners, I believe that we can use ourselves as an instrument of care as our patients and the people we love around us face their own changes and transitions and impermanence. I think of change, as I mentioned, as the necessary constant that organizes life, but impermanence is the philosophical problem of change. And it is a concept that structures all of existence, including human life. And when we contemplate impermanence, that is really a contemplation of how we relate to change. And while the idea of impermanence is central to some spiritual and religious traditions, it was also the subject of very secular contemplation. Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who lived about a lot of years ago. I'm forgetting how many years ago he lived, but that dude was ancient. So he coined this phrase, panta re, which means that everything flows. And he always believed that life was always flowing into death and death into life, that there is a circularity that accommodates both inevitable change and the permanence of this cycling between the two. And he wrote, "You cannot step into the same river twice, but because both the person who would step into the river and the river itself were both subject to change. It was not the river alone that changed, we changed too. And the person who you are right now cannot step into a river or a bathtub or out into the sunshine twice." And he understood this. In other spiritual traditions, the idea of impermanence and understanding and learning to embody it is a very big part of the philosophy. So in Buddhism, birth, suffering, illness, and death are seen as inescapable. And to resist those is to lead to dukkha, or suffering. Detachment and surrender are really the parts of life that Buddhism asks its followers to cultivate, because it is only with detachment and surrender that we can really embrace the fact that everything will change, whether we want it to or not. In Hinduism, in the Katha Upanishad, there's a concept of anitya, which is similar to the Buddhist concept of dukkha. And it requires us to embrace impermanence while allowing for the appreciation of what can never change, which is the soul that lives within us. And in Christianity, from the Corinthians, we have the line, "What is seen is temporary, what is unseen is eternal." So these traditions really sought to take what Heraclitus saw as something that is an indisputable fact, but offer its followers a way to learn to accommodate that fact rather than resist it. If impermanence is this great river that runs through life, then what we also need to kind of move into is, how do we accept this? How do we cultivate our relationship to surrender and to acceptance? Because all of these things challenge our sense of control over our stories and our circumstances. And part of embracing our stories, and what a story even is how does someone change as their circumstances change? And thinking about impermanence in our work and in our lives is not an anesthetic. It's not a synonym for fatalism. It doesn't ask us to step away from the feelings and emotions that accompany change. But it is finding a way to move through change in a way that allows us in some ways to be examples to our patients who are moving through some of the most profound of changes. And I think in palliative medicine, I've heard us described very often as uncertainty experts, and that is certainly very, very true. We are navigating people through uncertainty, unexpected change, and these challenges of acceptance and surrender. We are also experts in change and transition. And those are slightly different from uncertainty, which is where I think impermanence becomes a very big part of how we think about what we do and what we do. So once again, I thought that I was good with impermanence, just like I once thought that I was good with death. And then COVID came, and we were facing some of the biggest uncertainties imaginable. It was a sudden and stark reminder of what I knew intellectually, that anything can happen at any time. We were suffering from fear and anxiety on a mass, unprecedented scale, and trying to figure out what this shift meant for the people around us and the people we loved. Communication became virtual, and the ways that we used to talk to people that animated our relationships with them were suddenly taken away. And our fears of loss and our inability to be with our loved ones was overwhelming and palpable, both with the patients I saw and their families, but also within my own life and the people I loved. And I suddenly wondered to myself, how in the world am I going to make it through this? How in the world are we all going to make it through this? And so much of what I ended up doing early on was being taken away from the things that had rooted me previously. I was in endless meetings, as many of us were, preparing for some of the worst unknowns, like how would we allocate resources if things came to that? And the thing that really took me back to this philosophy of impermanence was seeing this rapid cycle of death happen. And I want to tell you about several patients who all occupied the same bed in the ICU. The arrival of COVID for me was when a 50-year-old elementary school teacher was carried down the stairs of her home by her 20-year-old son, who saw that she was gasping. He'd told me later how her lips turned blue, how her skin was ice against his, as he willed himself not to drop her. The winter of COVID was a man in his 70s who had gotten a new lease on life when he stopped drinking and got a liver transplant, the type of man who loaded up the trunk of his car with shoes and clothes and blankets so that he could offer them to the homeless who lived right around the corner from him. 2 years after his transplant, 2 years into his new inhabitants of his new life, he would die in our ICU behind impersonal glass panes, brightened by the reflection of Christmas lights strewn around the nurses' station. The summer after COVID began was the brother of a colleague who refused vaccinations, who went on spring break and was found delirious in a pool of his own urine, who was put on ECMO and promised the world because he was young and he was not supposed to die, but died nonetheless by his sister's admission, a loud life that left as a whisper. As I mentioned, each of these patients were in the same bed in the ICU, and that bed to me became an airport of sorts, a place of arrival and departure, and a cycling that took me back to this idea that everything will change and that we can be in one place, and the change of the patients, the cycling of life and death, is really an illustration of what I had seen years ago in that Buddhist temple, a philosophy that had escaped me in the total overwhelm of the early months of the pandemic. And then one day, I was walking to the cancer center, which is right across from the main hospital. And I'd always loved walking there because these were like a grove of trees that in Los Angeles actually changed color. And so it was a delight for me to just stand there looking at these trees, picking up their leaves as they changed like a big weirdo, and taking pictures of their different shades as the fall, the quote unquote fall in Los Angeles began. And I was walking with my team and I looked at this tree and I saw the leaves falling, and I saw a tree in the parking lot that was bare. That's the other picture. And this thought came to me that the people I'm taking care of are falling like leaves. And all of a sudden, I was taken back to that place I was in fellowship where I needed something to hold on to. And I needed this return to an emotional reconnection, not just an intellectual one, but something I felt in my body and in my practice about what impermanence meant and how it could be my savior in doing this work as I helped my patients and their families through this. And it was a really interesting return to this, because what I really had to find for myself is I need to find a way of befriending impermanence. And a mentor of mine, B.J. Miller, talks about what it means to befriend death. But for me, the challenge here was, how do I befriend impermanence? How do I make this relationship a part not just of my practice, but of my life? It meant slowing down for me and looking at my own mortality as I had never looked at it before. It meant really thinking about what I had seen with the falling of the leaves from that tree and with the falling of my patients, the cycling in and out of human life in that ICU bed. And when I really sat with this beyond the intellectualizing, what I found was that I could actually drop into my own grief, which had been suppressed for so many years, because with impermanence and with change always comes loss. And I had intellectualized it instead of felt it. And that was the moment during the pandemic that I could actually grieve, that I was freed to grieve. And that, I think, is one of the gifts of this philosophy, is that even though the things we fear, the changes that we know are coming in our lives, the lives of the people we love, or the lives of our patients and their families, there is fear and resistance, and there is also freedom in the change that impermanence invites us to really contemplate. And I began returning to what I had first heard in that temple, which is this idea in Buddhism, I am of the nature to die. And instead of saying just that, I started saying to myself, I am of the nature to change. And I began to meditate on that concept, whether it meant putting my hand on my heart and saying, my heart is of the nature to change. My breath is of the nature to change. The tree in front of the cancer center is of the nature to change. The patient in front of me is of the nature to change. And how might that be a tool that I could use clinically? To offer 2 quotes about this that I found very healing around this time. Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a very famous Vietnamese Buddhist monk, said 2 very profound things. 1, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. Life itself is possible. If a grain of corn is not impermanent, it can never be transformed into a stalk of corn. If the stalk were not impermanent, it could never provide us with the ear of corn we eat. And also, impermanence does not necessarily lead to suffering. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they are not. These are a couple pictures from my childhood that I also went back to when thinking about this idea of change and all the things that I had resisted, thinking I really knew this philosophy. And looking back at these pictures and these albums during the pandemic, when I was basically alone and isolated, allowed me to feel just how much I had been resisting change in my own life, or resisting who I was becoming because I was so tied to ideas from the past about who I was, or in relation to others, or in relation to myself. So change invites that contemplation. Upheaval allowed me the opportunity for contemplation. It allowed me to really sit and think about everything that arose for me and not try to push it down. And it allowed me in that process to be a better doctor, because I was asking my patients to feel what was so hard and overwhelming for them to feel when I could not do that myself. I don't believe that we are required to do that inner work for the sake of our patients. I believe we do this inner work for the sake of ourselves. And through that, we can be a healing tool for our patients. And I started to think about how I could use what I was learning as a human and as a doctor in that time to really introduce the idea of impermanence and change more directly into my clinical encounters. So I started experimenting and trying to bring this idea into the hospital rooms or into the clinic. And I started asking people things like this, which are totally non-evidence-based and from the Puri mind factory. So feel free to take what works and definitely leave the rest. But tell me how you've coped with difficult changes in the past. Tell me about a difficult transition in your life, whether that's retirement, moving cross-country, losing someone you loved. How did you know it was a challenging transition? How did it feel in your body and in your mind? How did you tolerate distress? And who was in your support system? And I very much recognized that the transitions we're seeing people go through physically, emotionally, and spiritually in the realm of palliative is very, very different than the experience of moving cross-country. But some of those principles still apply. We're asking people to go back to something they thought might have been intolerable in one way or another, and we're asking them to drop into their older selves and see what continuity there might be. Looking back, what did you think were useful ways to cope, and what was surprisingly challenging, but also what was surprisingly easy? How did you surprise yourself in this time that we're talking about? And as we talk about what you're going through now, what is the continuity and what is the rupture that you sense and that you feel? And telling people what strikes me as I listen to you is your resilience. I recognize that resilience is also an overused word, and it kind of comes in to stand in for many more complex things, but it is really true that when we survive something that we don't think we can survive, there's something within us that we don't necessarily recognize as resilient. So what I hear as I listen to you is your resilience. You made it through something at the time you felt was utterly impossible. And even though you face very different transitions right now, what you have described to me is impermanence in multiple ways. There's the impermanence of the situation, and there was the impermanence of your feelings and the suffering and the pain that was there at the time. And those may never have gone away, but they may have changed. And that too is an example of what it means for everything we face in life to pass like the clouds in the sky. These are the things that will change for our patients and their families and for ourselves and our lives. Our physical pain and emotional suffering, our family suffering and our grief. And even though the biggest loss that we're helping people confront is a life and death loss or a quality of life, death, and loss, these are the things that we have overcome before, and we were able somehow to leverage strength we didn't know we have to cope with incredibly profound change. And I have faith that we can draw on that strength again to confront the change we're facing right now. I want to end in 12 seconds by reading a poem that I think very profoundly illustrates what we are able to learn from nature when it comes to the contemplation of change. And this poem is called The Promise by Jane Hirschfield. "Stay," I said to the cut flowers. They bowed their heads lower. "Stay," I said to the spider who fled. "Stay, leaf." It reddened, embarrassed for me and itself. "Stay," I said to my body. It sat as a dog does, obedient for a moment, soon starting to tremble. "Stay," to the earth, of riverine valley meadows, of fossiled escarpments, of limestone and sandstone. It looked back with a changing expression in silence. "Stay," I said to my loves. Each answered, "Always." There's something profound that we can learn about impermanence of change from our patients, from ourselves, and from the world around us. And I think that poem really encapsulated beautifully what it means to want things to stay the same, the pain of them changing, and the things that we can learn as we move through transitions, both the events and the pain that accompanies them. Thank you so much. Sorry for going over time.
I do not accept your apology. Things change. Thank you so much, Dr. Puri, for your vulnerability and for letting us into your Puri Mind Factory, which I think is something I would like to learn more about. And fortunately, through your writing, I think we get an opportunity to learn more from you. And I thank you so much for your reflections on impermanence. It certainly caused me to question myself in thinking about this man stepping into the river, how I have changed and how the river has changed. And I think that gives us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful introduction to our Congress. I think you can see that there are big ideas that are discussed here across a range of topics with research and stories, and I'm so excited for what the next 2 days have to come. I would like to thank our sponsors, our very generous sponsors, the Ministère du Tourisme du Québec, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, Palliative Canada, Arbor Memorial, the Flanders Family, the Cole Foundation, the Canadian Cancer Society, Hope and Cope, the Hay Foundation, the Teresa Dellar Palliative Care Residence, the Claudine and Stephen Bronfman Family Foundation, Bayshore Healthcare, Leica Équipements Médicaux, Community Service Benefits Trust, and Dr. Marcia Gilman and Michael Flinker. I would also like very much to thank our community partners, eHospice, who were extraordinary this year in helping us promote the Congress and tell the stories of our speakers, the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, the Canadian Hospice and Palliative Care Association, the Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians, the Council on Palliative Care, and Canadian Virtual Hospice. Thank you all so much for helping make this meeting possible. I invite all of you to join us next door for an opening reception. But before you go, I also wanted to point out that around you, you will find on your seats, or you may have found in your seats, a beautiful and stunning collection of poems that is part of our arts program for this Congress. And please feel free to take one and read it. I can't wait to meet some of you. I hope you'll join us in the opening reception, and I wish you the greatest of Congresses. I think we're so excited to have you here, and I hope it's as wonderful for you as it has been for us to put together. So thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.